The United States is in a state of security and supply.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. You get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me up. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm talking to Dr. Clyde W. Barrow, not the other Clyde Barrow of Lumpen fame himself, actually.
Yes,
So we are going to be talking today primarily about the Lumpenproletariat, but in general about categories of class that have emerged in this period of heavily financed capitalism that we call neoliberalism, or that's tied into deindustrialization. There's a bunch of words for it, and frankly, all of them are abused now. So we're going to focus in mostly on the deindustrialization elements of this, but we're going to begin with the predictions in the 60s made by people like Eldridge Cleaver and a lot of the Panthers. Actually, this is a huge debate in the Panthers themselves, that the future was going to be lumpenized. And then we'll kind of go back to Marx from there. One of the contentions in your book is that while not necessarily vindicating Cleaver's political strategy in regards to the lumpen, his prediction that as deindustrialization was going to continue from the 60s after the post-war largesse ended fairly quickly, that the future was going to be a much more lumpenized mass of people. And if you point out that his audience was actually not black lumpen proletariat, but to try to get the beginnings of a white lumpen proletariat, which had already, you don't go into this that much, but it already began to kind of be seen in the South in general because of the particular post-Reconstruction hesitancy of industrializing the South in the first place. So you always had in the Black Belt a white semi-lumpenized group of people who could be relied on to flip and break strikes, to work with the Klan or the police or whomever. And this led to a lot of things, including the fact that of all the areas of the United States, there really was kind of an Appalachian line for unionization and industrial unionism in America. And the kind of industrial work that you saw in the South until like the 50s was like agrarian industrial stuff and textiles, which are usually bad signs, like just historically speaking, and mining. And it seems to me that people coming out of the Black Belt would have just seen that more. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this a little bit as well. And it seemed like, from what I gathered from your book, that you think that what Cleaver was trying to do was to warn this white proletariat, while they were still proletariat, that the lumpenization that had already happened to almost all black people, they weren't deindustrialized, they were never industrialized in the first place in the most part, except in the Northeast. Yep. And to certain white communities in the South was going to happen to everybody.
Yep. If we start with Eldridge Cleaver's view, one of the things I always found fascinating about his work is that he identified a logic to capitalist development that really didn't become a prominent theme in Marxist political theory until the 70s and 1980s when people started reading Grande. And Cleaver was writing at a time before Grande had been translated into English and was even widely read in European Marxist circles. And of course, Cleaver himself considered himself a Marxist at that time. So I think he sort of had his finger on the future. Now, what he argued, as you pointed out, was that he was talking to the white working class, exactly as you're pointing out. And what he was trying to say to them is that blacks, particularly the Black Panther Party at that time, was the new vanguard of the proletariat. In other words, the Lumpen proletariat, the Black Lumpen proletariat, was the new vanguard of the Lumpen proletariat. And this is one of the places where he broke with what might have been considered the orthodox Marxism of the time. And his thinking was really revolved around technology, not so much globalization. His argument was that as technological development, what Marx would call the rising organic composition of capital, continue to unfold, there would be less and less need for labor. And of course, as you point out, in the North and Northeast and the Midwest, it had already happened as the urban centers were being deindustrialized, which displaced large numbers of former Black proletarians. And what he was trying to explain to them was, we've already seen this. We've already experienced it and been the victims of it. But this is going to happen to all of you because this is a logic of capitalist development that is universal. It will cross every industry. It will cross every section of the country. And you need to join us now if we're going to do something about it. But of course, he was also rightly skeptical about whether he would be successful in that argument, because he recognized that there were hierarchies within the working class itself, divisions based on union versus non-union, divisions based on race and gender, divisions based on region. And at one point, in despair, when he sort of began to move away from these, well, he didn't move away from the position, he began to just despair of it all, was he had a very interesting idea that he said, the cops are the first line of defense of capitalism. The white Lumpen proletariat will be the second line of defense. And I think that the rise of Trump has proven him to be correct on that point.
And what I think, when we look at Trumpism as kind of a crucial point, if we go all the way back to like the late 70s, we see this. And what I found interesting, and now we can pivot back to the beginning and then work our way back to the Panthers, is that you started seizing in. I think you said when did you start this research on the Lumpen proletariat? I think it was like in the beginning of Trump, or maybe even before that.
I had actually started toying with this during Trump's campaign in 2016, but I didn't. It's actually an idea I'd been thinking about since I was an undergraduate in college, in fact. And I had always toyed with it. But once I saw the Trump campaign of 2016, quite literally, I would see, Trump rallies, and then I would hear the media and hear the press talk about the angry white working class. And I would look at these people and go, they don't look working class to me. Certainly not like the ones that I grew up. And it got me thinking again about the Lumpen proletariat. So the point that I wanted to make at the time was that Trump doesn't explain anything. It's Trump that has to be explained, and that the social forces that led to the rise of Trump go back to at least the late 60s, mid 1970s, and the whole process of deindustrialization that has unfolded across this country. And the second was that because Trump was the effect of a large-scale logic of capitalist development underlying social movement, that regardless of whether Trump won or lost the election, Trumpism would continue because it's a social movement. It's embedded in the social structure. It's embedded in the logic of capitalist development at this point. So Trump could disappear. Trumpism will continue on.
I would say, my thing about the sui generisness of Trumpism is always like, well, I can point to the same development in almost every major capitalist country, and some like quasi-capitalist countries actually right now, where you see similar kinds of things coming closer and closer to power each time. And we literally just got out of 2 days ago, yet another French election where Le Pen came this much closer to winning. And so that illustrates to me that Trump is a phenomenon. And I had thought to link him to Bonapartism, but I had actually probably carried a lot of the not, I wouldn't say traditional, because this is not traditional before actually Cleaver, but after the Panthers, what you see is a hesitancy to talk about the lumpen proletariat or to even acknowledge it as a valid category, partly because it is assumed to be a class. And as a class, it seems incoherent. The list of things that are and you know, your research actually shows that this shows up in various places, not just the two most famous places in the writings on France, the list of people who are included. What I always used to struggle with was it both not only would be copacetic to things like the idea, it's direct relationship to the surplus population, but like, well, how can there be such a thing as such like a reserve army of labor if there's also a lumpen proletariat class, because their non-relation to production is actually very similar. What your research points out is that if you go into the letters and some of the other polemical writings that are less famous on Germany, I think it's Switzerland you talk about, Italy, what you see is this is actually much more developed, and that Marx was kind of aware that there was an overlap between the reserve army of labor, the surplus population, and the lumpen. And you posit that we shouldn't treat lumpen proletariat as a class, and that Marx doesn't really talk about it that way.
Yeah, in fact, what I argue is that technically speaking, if you define the lumpen proletariat by its non-relation to production, it by definition can't be a class in the Marxian scheme of things. And in fact, when Marx talks about it, and Engels as well, they use phrases like it is the refuse of all decaying classes. It's sort of a dumping ground that people fall into the lumpen proletariat. And you can, I think, start analytically with sort of a very clear, rigid distinction of you have the proletariat, and then on the other hand, you have the lumpen proletariat, properly speaking, as Marx often refers to it, which is what he considers sort of the parasitic, unproductive, chronically non-working, even criminal underclass. And you can draw this hard distinction between the two. But the reality is, not only in the writings that you've referenced, but I would suggest in this very long section on the general law of capitalist accumulation and Das Kapital, he lays out a whole series of categories that go from the industrial reserve army, which he considers to be part of the proletariat. They're just unemployed workers who happen to be unemployed usually on a cyclical or a seasonal basis, but then it just sort of goes down in kind of a descending hierarchy into the lumpen proletariat, properly speaking. And sort of the thrust of my argument is that and he calls that group in the middle the honest and working lumpen proletariat. Lenin referred to them as a semi-proletariat. And what they shared in common is maybe they work part-time, or they're seasonal workers, or their work is very precarious, that they kind of fall in and out of the proletariat, back to the lumpen proletariat, but they still have an attachment to the working class, an attachment to the proletariat. So it's not just a strict either or bifurcation. I mean, Marx himself recognizes that it's sort of a gradation that one is dealing with, sort of tails off into the lumpen proletariat. I use the word social category in the same sense that Nico Poulantzas uses that term, which is it's not a class. It's a very dynamic, heterogeneous, fluid sort of dumping ground that people move into it and out of it all the time. And I also think you need to think of it in dynamic terms, in terms of the concept of lumpenization. One doesn't just end up there, one is lumpenized over a long period of time and starts to take on the characteristics of the lumpen proletariat, which is something I think defined a lot of the people who were sort of at the spearhead of the January 6th event, which they get billed as sort of petty bourgeois, middle class, affluent. But when you actually look at the details, these are all people who are on the verge of bankruptcy. They were losing their businesses. They were having financial problems. They were being lumpenized at the very point at which they were the angriest and engaged in an insurrection. So I think it's a very fluid concept in Marx. I think it's a valid concept. It's been rejected by Marxists for a very long time. But some people even suggested, and I kind of suggest this at the end of the book, that it's kind of the honest and working lumpen proletariat is the majority of the proletariat at this point in period. And then the one thing that the Black Panthers gave us was at least some strategy for thinking about how to mobilize them and organize them as a progressive social force.
So I think what is interesting about this, and we're going to go into the finer details of the Marxist analysis, but a lot of people reject the lumpen proletariat as like one of the rare cases where Marx is just moralizing. Mm-hmm. And I have thought a lot about not just in Capital, but also in the theories of surplus value, or sometimes referred to as Capital Volume 4, that there is a couple of different schemas you can pull from Marx. There's socially necessary and socially unnecessary, and there's productive and unproductive. And lumpen, properly speaking, and I want that distinction noted for my audience, because Marx does make it, and you point out it's mostly in letters, which is why people don't know this, but the lumpen, properly speaking, are both socially unnecessary and unproductive. And in fact, because of that, they're parasitic, meaning that they engage in criminal activity to live off the productivity of other classes. Now, that he does not think that is true for everyone who's falling into all the categories that get linked into lumpen. And what I found interesting is that if you take that writing seriously in the letters about the honest and working lumpen, this whole supposedly new concept of precariat is basically the spectrum of people on the kind of going in and out of the reserve army of labor to almost falling into rank criminality, that are listed together in this broad category of lumpen. But we are not talking about the same people when we talk about the lumpen proletariat proper, which, like, for people who want to know what I would mean by that, think about the Aryan Nation, or like some of these organized street gangs whose social function is almost completely parasitic. And I used to sometimes, because I lived in Mexico and really thought about the cartels there, I used to think about them as even becoming kind of a lumpen bourgeoisie. They're almost that powerful, but they don't operate like the bourgeoisie does in the same way, because they don't really produce anything. They just, maybe you can argue that illicit they don't even produce illicit drugs; they just run them. So it's totally built on the production and of others. And the other thing that you point out is, unlike some of these other weird class categories or social groupings that occur in Marx, like say labor aristocracy or petit bourgeois, or finance aristocracy, the lumpen don't come from one background. Correct. Like that's unique to them, that they have can have origins in any class group.
That's absolutely correct. In fact, there's one very famous passage where he refers to the lumpen proletariat as the refuse of all classes. Let me address, you raised 2 or 3 really interesting points there. I'll try to address each one in sequence. Starting with this idea that, many people do reject the concept of the lumpen proletariat as just Victorian moralizing by Marx, and Marx at his worst. And so many people have said, just forget about it. And I mean, there's a whole tradition of Marxism coming out of the 60s that just says, forget this whole concept. It's irrelevant. We're just going to ignore it like it's not there. My argument is that if you look at his sort of most vitriolic uses of the term, he uses words like offal, refuse, scum. What I would suggest is these are all industrial terms, and these are the waste products of industrial production. And that's very much the way he sees them, even in his analysis in Das Kapital, which these are people who are necessary products of capitalist development, in the same way that waste is a necessary product of industrial production. And so I don't really see those epithets as Victorian moralizing. I see them as his effort to sort of give a descriptive meaning to this sociological category that ties it to industrial capitalism. That's my interpretation. Now, I don't have any direct, Marx saying that, but I think if you read it that way, it makes a lot of sense. The second thing is, you talk about there are a couple of instances that stand out in my mind very clearly in some of Marx's letters. There's one where he's recuperating from an illness in southern France, and he must have been at a fairly nice hospice facility of some sort. But it's almost the only time you see Marx talking about what we would today consider service workers, valets and attendants and people like that. And he calls them the honest Lumpenproletariat in that case, because their work is part-time, it's seasonal, it's precarious. And he makes a few comments about them as if he'd never seen them before. Maybe he hadn't, but he calls them the honest Lumpenproletariat. And there's an even more interesting one, I think, in some case of some letters by Frederick Engels in the 1880s about the East End dock workers in London. And of course, if you were a dock worker in those days, you basically showed up at the docks every morning. You hoped they let you in the gate. Whether you got a job that day depended on how many ships were there that needed to be loaded or unloaded. You might get a job, you might get not, and it was all piecework. So these were people who showed up for work every day, but they didn't work every day, and they might not work all day. They lived in what were essentially slums and Lumpen neighborhoods. And I know Engels makes two comments about how he's very worried about how these honest, hardworking people are going to be sort of contaminated, is almost what he uses, by their environment that they live in, that they're going to adopt the Lumpen way of life. But he also optimistically points to them as sort of maybe the beginnings of industrial unionism, that maybe what we need to do is quit focusing our attention on these craft unions of skilled workers and start figuring out ways to create big encompassing unions that will bring people like that into the movement. And he doesn't use the word industrial union, but clearly that's what he's thinking about. And so there was clearly, some grappling toward the end of their lives with the idea that there is this class of people who they're not really proletariat in the strict sense. They're not Lumpen proletariat, properly speaking, but they're kind of part of the working class. And we need to figure out a way to mobilize them and bring them in to the left social movement, because in many ways they may well be the future of the working class.
Right. I mean, and I think in some ways, I think objectively, if you look at the stats right now, like industrial production is something between 9 and 11% of labor in the developed world, and that's actually becoming true even in the developing world. Mm-hmm. And so if we take that seriously, and we also take Marxist insight about what happens to the petit bourgeoisie seriously, and I think the underlying social conditions that lead to Trumpist grievances in like rural America, to me, is related to the Lumpenization of the rural and ex-urban petit bourgeoisie, particularly the white rural and ex-urban petit bourgeoisie. But I actually, my fear is it won't stay that way, and we'll talk about that later. Okay. That it won't just stay white, and it's that those people are also being lumpenized. If you look at, and I come from that world, I come from Central Georgia. Unlike a lot of Marxists I know, I'm not from a coastal city. Mm-hmm. I never hung out in Brooklyn. I wasn't paid for by Marxists to come talk to them. And that little snide comment is to point out, though, I have felt like those communities have been lumpenized for a long time. You read, it's a clearly reactionary book, J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, but that's what he's describing is the lumpenization of the ex-industrial Appalachia, Rust Belt South borderline, in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s.
Yeah, there's a more recent, less well-known, in the same vein, Kevin Williamson's White Ghetto.
Mm-hmm. And another, also a reactionary book, but one
Yes.
that's weirdly honest, like
by a guy from Texas.
Yeah, I know. Actually, I own that book, and I was like, well, I don't agree with the conclusions you're drawing about this, but your conditions that you're stating are very real.
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking about the hipness of like the term precariat and all this gig work and piecework that's been beginning to happen through disruption. That's also, you know, that would be, if we take Marx's categorization from those letters seriously, Marx and Engels' categorization from this letter seriously, they would also be honest, you know, the honest and working lumpen. That there's not stable work. They can fall into the category at any time. There's no predictability, etc. And I think what you document is the socialist question, the secondary question for a lot of socialists. Kautsky, in the classical period of in the Second International up through the beginning of the Third, is trying to answer what to do, not just with the lumpen properly speaking, which there are different answers to handle that too.
Yeah.
But this other category of people in this like borderline class that Marx and Engels started seeing. And if you look at the end of industrial, I mean, like when I was talking about productive and unproductive labor, we should also mention that rentier capital and finance aristocracy are all both socially unnecessary and, well, some of them might, some finance capital could be socially necessary, kind of, but in general, they're both socially unnecessary and unproductive. And they were even, that's not just Marx, like classical economics of the capitalist variety considered them unproductive too.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, that takes me back. That's the third thing that I wanted to address that I forgot about. You take me back to that. Marx also has a category called the Lumpen aristocracy. He has the Lumpen literati. He's got all kinds of lumpens, which is one of the reasons many people have considered a somewhat inchoate concept. But what he was getting at there too was that if you took what we might today call finance capital, he called them the finance aristocracy, was that they too share a common non-relation to production, that they live off parasitic extractions of value without contributing to the production of value in any way. And in many respects, he points out, they live the same lifestyle as a lumpen, just at a higher level of economic well-being, and they sort of become the image of what a successful lumpen looks like, which I think is the attraction of a Trump. Because if you were to think of Trump and give an honest description of himself as a guy who's been married 3 times, has 4 children by 3 different mothers, has been in court constantly, accused of all kinds of crimes, et cetera, is accused of being addicted to Adderall or who knows what. I mean, if you added that up, that's exactly the kind of sort of negative epithet that people use to describe the lowest of the lowest of the lumpen proletariat, and they're just mirror images of each other, looking at each other. And I think because of that, he has a connection to them at that level, a cultural connection that he shares with them, in addition to being economically parasitic. And Marx was literally trying to draw that connection, that what he called in some ways Bonapartism, while it rested on the electoral base of a petit bourgeoisie that was under threat, he nevertheless saw in some respects Bonapartism as an alliance of the unproductive classes at the top and the bottom against the productivist classes, both the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So I take that affinity seriously, and I address it in the book, and I go through all the relevant passages to try to document it. But I do think it's something to be taken seriously and not to just sort of jettisoned, because it also helps explain the Trump phenomenon, I think, in very serious analytic terms. And I guess at the end of this, one of the things I was really trying to do with this book, as you referenced the precariat and all these concepts that have come out, was just to sort of argue that, Marxism does have the analytic tools to explain and understand these developments. And it's always been there. It's just that Marxists haven't taken their own category seriously. And so they've gone off and developed new words and neologisms to explain it. But the analytic tools are there within the Marxist framework.
Which I think is an interesting point. And I want to kind of get to the various answers to this problem that come out of the Second and Third International, because in each of those societies, for different reasons, you had class formations and rapid decay and rapid entropy, and in the Russian and Chinese case, it's because you're transitioning out of an older mode of actually a bunch of older modes of production, if we're completely honest, not just one. And in the case of Germany, is you have a stagnating economy that's highly efficient, but didn't get in on the imperial game, and thus sees declines in profits faster, according to the Hilferding Bukharin analysis. And so it's also having a lot of people thrown out, particularly a lot of these artisan craft people that have been even a big part, like Marx talks about them as kind of like, well, they're part of our coalition, particularly in the early communist movement in the 1850s. They're not really proletariat because they kind of own their means of production, but they're not even fully bourgeois yet. They're like working in like semi-medieval guilds and stuff like that. So you have these people who are barely petit bourgeois and then immediately fall out. And that's one of the many bases for fascism. Like, it's one of the mass bases for them. And I think your argument is that's the petit bourgeois is the electoral base. That's the kind of formal political base because they vote.
Yes.
But the politics, both in the street and in the spectacle now, like on the internet, is waged far beyond the electoral calculus. So the mass base of any political group will include a shit ton of non-voters.
Yep.
Right?
Now, that's exactly I do draw a distinction. And, as people have questioned me about this and I've had debates with various people, I've tried to clarify, I think, a distinction that wasn't as clear as it could have been in the book, was that, there is a very clear distinction between the electoral base of Trump, which I think is very heavily anchored in the petite bourgeoisie, and the mass base of Trump, which predominantly consists of non-voters. And that's what sweeps up the Lumpenproletariat, particularly the white Lumpenproletariat, and importantly sweeps up those elements that have been the most radicalized, the most militant. And, one of the things I try to call, and I called this, I think, before it happened, was to point out to people, you're not taking, the left doesn't take seriously enough, and the Democratic Party does not take seriously enough the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, the Proud Boys. And as I pointed out in one place, if you take up the combined membership of these armed right-wing militias, there's at least 60,000 of them. That is 6 armed battalions of infantry troops if they ever organized in one place. And that's not counting probably God knows how many fellow travelers who could be mobilized under the right circumstances to join them. And I think we are starting to learn that they were sort of the spearhead amid all that chaos on January 6th. I'm sure there were just a lot of nitwits there, but there was a group of people using that as a smokescreen to operate a plan that they were going to carry out in terms of an insurrection. So those are the people that I think are the most dangerous, and I just don't think they've been taken seriously enough. And my guess was that Biden wouldn't do much about it, and they haven't. They haven't.
I mean, it also seems like that finance capital and its relationship to our capitalist committee of oversight, aka the government, has kind of led to a de-skilling of even our quote elites unquote. I'm always hesitant to use that word for a variety of reasons because it's sometimes a right-wing dog whistle, but I do think there's a real truth in that we have the most educated, the most credentialed, and in a lot of ways the most socially isolated elite we've ever seen in the developed world. And yet they also, for all that credentialing, all that education, all that specialization, seem fundamentally incompetent at basic things. For example, not being an idiot when you are, say, investigating a militia group and doing things that would be considered entrapment.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
something like
yeah,
that. Like,
yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, you can go back to the old, I went back, actually reread a book. I was cleaning off my bookshelf, the old, the church committee investigations, when back, what was that, the 70s or yes, 1970s, and all the just documented, clever and I would say brilliant schemes for undoing the left, whether it was the Black Panthers, the Socialist Workers' Party, student movement organizations, the SDS, and on, that wasn't uncovered, for a decade or 2 decades, not even counting the stuff the CIA was doing going back to the 1950s. And they seemed particularly adept and skilled at dismantling the left from within. But yeah, when it comes to dealing with right-wing militias, they don't seem to be particularly adept at either at knowing what they're about to do or at uncovering their activities and prosecuting them effectively. That's been something of a disappointment for me, but not unexpected.
Right. I mean, it's not. I think of things like Ruby Ridge and the Waco incident, honestly, where you have incompetent acceleration that leads to, targeting. I mean, honestly, targeting minor players in the case of Ruby Ridge, doing things that are kind of indefensible and yet also speak to like blatant incompetence. Like it's just that sort of thing we've seen increasingly since the late 80s, early 90s.
Well, there's maybe someday I'll actually getting around to put this on paper, but I do have a talk I did on a paper that's not finished called the Deconstruction of the American State, where I took Steve Bannon's claim that their role was to deconstruct the administrative state. And if you go through in detail, many of the things that Trump was doing that while he was the president, that just seemed incomprehensible to a lot of people, starting with having a third of the position of the State Department vacant. But, the attacks on the FBI, the attacks on many agencies. There was a very clear effort to sort of dismantle the state, to weaken the state from within, and to render it incompetent. As I always tell my students, when the state's incompetent, when the state can't do its job, who benefits from that? Well, the people who already have the power, finance capital, and many others benefit from that. And any group that benefits from chaos benefits from that. So, I don't want to become a great defender of the state, but there are effects of this.
Right. I think this leads me to a question that I kind of talked to you a little bit about off air to kind of warn you about it. You mentioned a lot about Trump's role in the particular in a kind of lumpen financial aristocracy, like the amount of just blatant financial shenanigans that happened. And it's pretty well documented they did. But I have been looking also at the role that the Democrats have played with the more establishment and seemingly above board elements of the financial class, particularly around banking and tech. And it does seem like the financial capitalist, if they've been fighting the industrial capitalists since the 60s, that for reasons that I actually don't even think are politically motivated, I think they have to do with things like the tendency, right, of profit to
Yeah.
decline. But
Yeah,
that's
that's
controversial in our circles. Actually, almost everything. As a side note, almost everything that is part of Marx is controversial in Marxism right now by somebody.
Yes. Yes.
Including like the working class as an agent of history and this, that, and the other. I wondered, what role do you think that finance capital, and I'm not positing this as a conspiracy theory. I don't think anyone's thinking about this and deliberately doing it. But what role do you think has finance capital's relationship to, say, the Democratic Party contributed to this ability of lumpen and petit bourgeois, even though they're becoming fiscally unstable and they're socially only powerful because of their potential numbers? Why do you feel like, one, there's been like when people describe the white working class in quotation marks, to me what they're often describing, like what you, is a mixture of like the spectrum of lumpenized people and the petit bourgeois and their spectrum of success until you get above, say, people who own $200,000 a year and live in a major city. But then I look at the coalition of, say, the Democrats and their electoral base. It isn't workers anymore either.
Right.
Like, it's people who make less than $80,000 a year, which would be, I guess, a lot of that would have to fall into that honest, into honest and working lumpen category. And then it's people who make over $200,000 a year. That's their electoral base. That's an incoherent electoral base.
Yeah. Well, two things here. We can do a little bit of American history here. It may be controversial. I'm sure some people will disagree with me. I would make, I think, two major points here, which partly go back to my book on critical theories of the state. One would be is that sort of up until the end of the New Deal, say the mid-1970s, there were two major segments or political wings to the capitalist class. What some would call the corporate liberals, which is largely led by finance capital, which I take not just to be investment bankers, but the industrial corporations that were tied to finance capital. Monopoly capital would be another word for it. And then the ultra-conservative wing of the capitalist class, which was largely the smaller competitive capitalists, the nationalists. And if you had to put a title to it, it was the Business Roundtable against the National Association of Manufacturers. The corporate liberals were dominant, and what characterizes the corporate liberals historically was they were willing to make certain kinds of concessions and compromises in order to maintain the stability of the overall system. They successfully integrated the trade union movement into that coalition, and it was anchored in the Democratic Party, particularly in the New Deal. I think once you hit the so-called profit squeeze of the mid-1970s and stagflation, the corporate liberal wing gravitated to the ultra-right, the Business Roundtable, the Committee on Economic Development, now no longer sound any different than the Chamber of Commerce or the National Association of Manufacturers, because they felt maybe they had gone too far in those concessions. And so they sort of let the sort of, I wouldn't call them rogues, but they sort of let the Yahoo wing of the capitalist class run wild, starting with Ronald Reagan. And in that context, I think what also happened was the Democratic Party fundamentally changed in response to the McGovern election in 1972. And if you go back and look at the debates in the Democratic Party at that time, you saw the rise of what in the old days we called the Atari Democrats, the Bill Bradleys, the Michael Dukakis, the Paul Tsongas, in which they all made a post-industrial argument about the working class that we have built our base on is a declining class. They were accepting that argument too. We can no longer rely on that as our social base going forward. And so what we're going to rely on is this newly emerging professional, managerial, technical class, the people, as you mentioned, the 80 to over 200,000 group of people. That's going to be the core of our base going forward. The college educated people who are, by the way, socially liberal, but fiscally and economically conservative. So in terms of economic policies, the Democratic Party came to not look much different than the Republican Party. And there was the so-called Washington Consensus among both parties on neoliberal economic policies. So, in that respect, the Democratic Party have been kind of the loyal opposition, the junior partners in the neoliberal coalition. And one of the things I do talk about in the book was, look at the response of the Democratic Party to deindustrialization was to completely ignore it. Now, I lived in Massachusetts for 27 years, and I watched that neoliberal coalition just sort of jettison the working class to the side as if it didn't matter. And their response was always the same. Go get a college education. Even during Biden's campaign, he's talking to unemployed coal miners, telling them you need to learn how to code. I'm sorry, that's not a solution for a 55-year-old coal miner or to any person in the working class who's lost their job and probably doesn't even have a high school diploma. But you've got this sort of myopic educational elite, and that's why this Trump rhetoric about the liberal elite resonates with them so much, because it's this kind of paternalistic, if you would become like us, everything would be okay. But never do they propose something like a Green New Deal that might reinvigorate the working class.
So there's a couple of trends I've noticed lately, but I literally, when I came back, I spent a large part of the aught teens out of the country, and I came back and I was sitting down with a liberal teacher friend of mine, and we were talking about it, and he talked about how he had moved from New York to Texas, and he came from, in many ways, I love the guy, but he's kind of a fail son of this, people who were brought into this management professional strata, right? And he said to me, like, why don't these people move? And I said to him, and I was like, look, when I became a teacher from Central Georgia, I could not afford to move to get another job. It was actually easier for me to move by taking an academic position in another country than it was for me to even move to a different teaching district within the US because of the expense of moving. And so you don't understand why these people are stuck. They do not have the wealth to get out of this situation. And sometimes, and like I was feeling this way in the alt teens, even having an education doesn't do it. And so their way out is often, and to get back to the Lumpen, and these things that depend on Lumpenized populations, was to go into the police or the military or both.
Yep.
Like, I talk a lot about the fact that during this time period of neoliberalism, military Keynesianism was allowed. And, that's where you saw Keynesian policies were maintained, and literally entire economies in this deindustrialized South in particular are totally dependent on military bases. And that's not just because people are soldiers. They're servicing businesses that service soldiers. They're working in school systems that service soldiers. They are working as clerks at VA hospitals. They're working as clerks at Boeing, all servicing this military industrial complex where there is still government largesse invested.
Absolutely. Actually, in my book, I talk about a letter. Engels has a letter exchange with a Dutch businessman at one point who's asking for Engels' advice about his son who wants to join the army. And Engels tells him, that's basically for lumpens, that the army is always an outlet for absorbing the surplus population in an industrial society. And it becomes another form of, what they use the phrase, bribe tools of reaction. You enlist them in the service of the state, in the service of the ruling class, to carry out its missions domestically and abroad. We have a great example of that, a version of it, where I live here in the Rio Grande Valley, which is literally the most impoverished, lowest income region of the continental United States. Only Puerto Rico has a lower median income, but there is a huge impetus, therefore, to go into the Border Patrol. At my university, the criminal justice program, which largely trains prison guards and Border Patrol agents, it has over 2,000 majors. Because for a poor Hispanic person, a $45,000 a year job with government benefits and stable employment looks very attractive. And then you throw on to that the state police, the local police, the DEA, the FBI, the National Guard. I'm actually living in a very militarized, occupied zone here, but it has realigned the electoral base of the region to become increasingly Republican as these people vote to save their occupations and to secure their livelihood. So it's actually been a very good electoral strategy for the Republican Party.
Yeah, this is what I have noticed is the Democratic coalition, while it is technically more numerous in the larger broad population, it is not as predictable. I mean, and that's because it's hard to see what the united interests really are, and you have the superficial partisanship problem. But when you look at, for example, when people tell me, well, people in the Lumpen are not voting for their interests, I'm like, are they not? Is it really in the long term? You're right, and I actually agree with you. In the long term, they're supporting things that will continue their Lumpenization. Yeah. But the problem, and this is, and then we will actually get to the history, but I do want to talk about the democratic role in the strategy. And I'm glad that this had come up in your book on the state, because I hadn't read that, but that this all kind of adds together. That the strategy that they've had does kind of seem like, you might, yes, they will theoretically throw around a Green New Deal when they're in the opposition, but you will never see that even remotely get close to even being rejected formally by the Democratic Party when they have two parts of government, because they have to deal with the upper end of their coalition who is actually against it. Yeah. Right. Yep. And so that kind of leads me to this, backtracking now back to the problems that we saw. So Marx and Engels are seeing this develop and becoming, even in their time, as soon as you hit the height of industrial capital in Europe, they start seeing, these service workers as seasonal things. And yes, they get service work becomes more and more professionalized, but it's still essentially socially necessary, but semi-productive or even non-productive labor. And it's always adjacent because of its low wages, because of the profit margins in these businesses. And I used to be a manager of a food service. The profit margins are shit. They really are. So I only did that for 6 months because I was like, oh, there's no future here. But you look at that and you can see, you might see large rentier profits in the economy like you do right now, actually. You might see extreme monopoly capital profits. But you look at these independent operators, these petit bourgeois operators, and even maybe things that are slightly larger than petit bourgeois, but are not on the national and international level, their profit rates plummet most of the time. And one of the reasons why I think we have to deal with this lumpenization of parts of the working class after this deindustrialized period is that also ties even the honest lumpen in these areas are going to be tied to the petit bourgeois and their fate. Because they're working in these franchises and small businesses as service people. They might even have a small productive job, but it's very precarious. They're working in direct extraction commodities, which is notoriously low profit margin, believe it or not. So something that pretty much everybody outside of some Keynesians accept is true. Even conservative economists talk about this. So where does that leave, this? Because it seems to me that in the Second International, they were already seeing this was going to be a major problem. And they didn't figure out how to handle it because the fascists happened. So
no, they absolutely did not. And I'll just sort of walk through some of those discussions because I found them very interesting. The theorists in the Second and Third International took the problem of the lumpen proletariat very, very seriously, because they had to grapple with it in actual revolutionary situations where they were reality. If you go back to Marx, Marx talks in places like the class struggles in France about how, at the outbreak of the 1848 revolutions, it was the lumpen proletariat who were the first to the barricades, the first to show the most bravery. But as soon as the bourgeoisie offered them a uniform, a few dollars, and a new gun, they were on the other side immediately, that they were unreliable and untrustworthy as a political ally. That's the problem that continually resurfaces. I know with Karl Kautsky, he had put forward the argument. He says they're just parasitic, they're unreliable, they're not proletarians. He actually just said suppress them. I mean, he was very vitriolic and antagonistic to the lumpen proletariat. Rosa Luxemburg's response to him was, no, why don't we do what the bourgeoisie does? Why don't we turn them into bribe tools of socialism? Let's just expand the welfare state as rapidly as possible and bring them into our coalition, and maybe even pacify them in that way and sort of take them out of the game if that's what it takes. When you got into the revolutions in Russia and China, both Lenin and Mao talk about incorporating them into the Red Armies, which they did. And both of them complain about how unreliable they are, that they're rogues, they're bandits. They just, they undercut the revolution by the fact that they basically engage in war crimes against their own people and sort of demoralize the good troops in the military. And all the only solution Mao could come up with was, well, we just have to keep them disciplined, keep them focused, and educate them to socialism. Right. But at the end of the day, nobody really had a solution that worked for them. All of them found their solutions unsatisfactory. And so I left it in some ways as a problem in my book, because it is a problem. And I don't know that there have been lots of solutions proposed, but I don't think anyone's found the answer. And I think it is today more of an urgent problem than has ever been because of the expansion of the lumpen proletariat.
Right. So I think, and I have to tell our audience, like, if you don't think the prison industrial complex is directly tied to like trying to control this, Chinese internal migration party is trying to control this. This is a constant problem that both capitalist and socialist states actually do plan around. And Mao's answer I think was interesting because Lenin doesn't come up with one. Sometimes he tries to incorporate them, sometimes frustrated, sometimes he shoots them. I mean, yes. Honestly. And what Mao tries to do is well, there's too many in China, right? So he talks about that, and they had a peasant base anyway. Yep. So he tries to educate them. They set these massive education centers for the non-hostile classes. And different one thing that is noted, there's a scholar, I can't remember her name, who wrote about this, but different kinds of lumpen react different ways. But the whole brainwashing thing doesn't happen. They do not produce consistent results in any category. I think they talked about what we would now call sex workers in this. And they could incorporate them into the working class at 50-60% rate. But other groups, they talked about former soldiers and bandits, their success rate was really, really small. And so it is a huge problem. And if you think about, I've been thinking about what when people describe what happened to the post-industrial working class in America, and you look at the opioid epidemic, you look at when the AIDS crisis went out of marginalized groups into the general population, it was disproportionately hit. And yes, it shows up in people of color, but it also, unfortunately, and this is one of the things people like Trump sees in on, it also shows up in the right lumpenized former proletariat too. And they, for reasons that are complicated and actually tied into structural racism, feel like they're completely left out of this discussion. Or I remember, for example, the way a lot of liberals responded when the opioid crisis started, and they're like, well, that's a white problem. I'm like, No, it's a lump. Well, I thought about it this way. It's a precarious. At the time, I was like, it's a precarious proletariat problem.
Right,
Like,
yeah.
like it's ubiquitous amongst the poorer working class.
Mhm.
And what is interesting about in our current time, with what the Panthers were talking about, is that maybe there was something like a left proletariat and a left lumpen proletariat and a right lumpen proletariat because they sided with different sides. But my response to that, and to even Cleaver, his story, I obviously didn't know him, I wasn't alive yet, but was like, yeah, but look at what happened to a lot of the leaders of your party, because the FBI consistently was able to use local paracriminal cops and drug addicts, to be honest, as informants to set up Panther members over and over again.
Mhm.
And while some of the the incorporation and delumpenizing of certain street gangs and stuff worked in certain areas, when other people attempted it, the famous story is the Crips, was not a Panther organization, but what's his name? The founder of the Crips did think about what he was trying to do initially as like a teen version of a local defense group. It immediately went into this.
Mhm.
Because one, there was no revolutionary. The Panthers didn't exist. There was no revolutionary cadre for it to tag up with. That's one thing. But it's also like there was nothing to support them either. So they had to engage in the activities to support themselves as a form of funding. And once that happens, the lumpenization spreads through your revolutionary group, and it's a problem.
Yeah, and it certainly makes it much easier for the police and other authorities to sort of criminalize what would otherwise be political activities, and to find reasons to arrest them and to break up the organizations. At the same time, and I think you point out that so much of this revolves around the destitution and the desperation of people who live in these conditions, that's exactly what Marx said opens them up to being bribed tools of reaction. But Cleaver also pointed out that there are other ways in which they can become bribed tools of reaction, which was in response to a lot of the urban riots of the 1960s. We saw this very dramatic expansion of the American welfare state, what some called the dole. And Cleaver had mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, he said, yeah, I know people have to eat. I know that people have to, put clothes on their kids. And at the end of the day, he said, they're just going to buy off the whole lumpen proletariat by giving them just enough to get by. And until such time as they decide they don't want to do it again. But he was also, he was certainly one of the people who criticized social welfare as a form of sort of corporate bribery, as a form of sort of bribing the lumpen proletariat into acquiescence.
So I do want to talk about a little bit, because we talk about Cleaver a lot, and the Panthers in general. I do want to state, though, this was a debate within the Panthers, because, for example, Fred Hampton was highly skeptical of the lumpen proletariat thesis.
This was a position that was primarily articulated by Huey Newton and Cleaver. And, it's a prominent position because they were the leaders of the Panther for a period of time.
And they're the leaders that survived. So.
Yeah. But yeah, it was certainly a debate. It was not universally a position that was subscribed to by all of the leadership, or even in all of the various city chapters of the Panthers.
What I think is interesting is I think a lot of people also misunderstand, and even I used to misunderstand Cleaver's argument, because I thought when they said the lumpen was the vanguard, that they were saying that the lumpen was the revolutionary subject, period. And when I reading your book, I was actually inspired to go back and read some of those Cleaver readings and try to read them more charitably than I've been inclined to in the past. And I realized, no, that's not what he's arguing. He's arguing that these specific conditions have made them kind of advancedly aware of the future conditions for almost all of the proletariat. So in that sense, they may be useful. But he wasn't arguing that like, oh, because they're criminal. He wasn't like an illegalist arguing, oh, because they're criminals, they're going to be more useful for a revolutionary.
That would have been Max Stirner's argument.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, that's where the word comes from, is Marx's debate with Max Stirner in the German ideology is literally the point at which Marx and Engels invent the term Lumpenproletariat to distinguish that group from what they saw as the industrial proletariat. But going back to Cleaver and Newton, again, if you look at what they were doing, I think you captured their intent correctly. They were very actively attempting to mobilize coalitions. Today, we would call it an intersectional coalition. I mean, they were even making overtures to LBGT groups at the time, to women's groups, to white trade unionists, to students, to white students. And so exactly as you said, they saw themselves as being acutely aware of the logic of capitalist development, where it was going to take us as a nation. And we're trying to say, you're all going to end up here with us sooner or later. Better to join us now, create this sort of broad-based working class coalition, recognizing that this is the trajectory we're all on, and do something about it now before it's too late. Of course, that didn't happen. It didn't happen partly for exactly the reasons that Cleaver anticipated, which was structural racism.
You have structural racism, which had been experimented. I used to tell people even before I read the Panthers that just coming from the South, and I was like, look, the vanguard of oppression is usually first the Black community and the indigenous community, then other communities of color, then poor white people, then everybody who isn't rich. Like that's usually the order of operations. So one of the worries that I've had, and one of the things I wanted to mention about the current weirdness that we see in the Democratic Coalition is in some ways, I'm not a person who thinks you can reduce race to class, but I do think there has been a particular embrace of a section of the professional strata that is of color, that is actually largely immigrant, but used to represent all people of color, that's been adopted by the Democratic Party. I don't think consciously. I don't think this is like some cynical ploy. It's who their base is now because of changes in the economy and changes particularly in the areas in which they have the strongest organic base, which is in the richest areas of the country. I think that's also making this hard to appeal to now, because there's a lot of evocations of structural racism, which I totally agree with, that are used in a way to kind of conflate implicit bias and outright bigotry as the same thing, and then have like elites of certain racial groups stand in as representation for all of them and pretend like there's not class divisions there as well.
Right.
And that is, that has led to a lot of you want to talk about like the internal contradictions of Black Lives Matter. And I'm not saying this, I'm a white dude, so I should be careful saying this, but like as a person who was involved in that here in Salt Lake, there were split off Black Lives Matters organizations around like respectability politics in regards to this, how you should incorporate black and business owners of color. And it led to like there's 3 Black Lives Matters chapters here that split along these lines. Now Black Lives Matter has also had, unfortunately, and it's come out recently, kind of its own Lumpen problem, because there's not one master organization with transparency and discipline. There have been certain groups that have like massive amounts of monies disappeared from donations, et cetera, and so forth. And I think Daniel Tutt asked you about this. There was also a lot of financial capital involved in some of that because of that it was a mixed movement. Part of it is the same class group of people with a straight historical tradition going all the way back to even before the Panthers. Part of it's not. part of it was a hashtag, and so there was no like it's hard to see. I guess what I'm saying is it seems like on one hand we've seen the most proletarian and honest lumpen activism in American history around these events in the last 5 years, including with a huge amount of proletarianized and lumpenized white people. At the same token, you also saw these divisions within these movements because of class divisions and orientations within the Black community and the community of color at large develop immediately. And you saw, unlike the first time, even with Black Lives Matter, a lot of direct financial investment start going into this.
Yep.
Do you think that this is, and again, I have to say this because a lot of people hear this and they think I'm pushing a conspiracy theory, and I'm not. I don't think this is thought out that way. I don't think that's how class stuff works. Do you think that's had an effect at kind of neutralizing some of these movements?
Well, not really a question I've given any thought to. I think would be my initial response.
Okay.
I think the more broad-based any movement gets, the more divisions you're going to have within that movement, and the more that it's going to have a tendency to splinter and fragment. So that's not surprising because, as you say, Black Lives Matter has probably been the most broad-based movement we've seen in decades. In fact, I was having the excitement of thinking that at some point it could evolve into what Rosa Luxemburg called a mass strike, which was the difference between that and an industrial or general strike, was that it does sweep up all these other groups beyond. It does sweep up the petit bourgeoisie. It does bring in the Lumpenproletariat. It basically, as she describes it, is the entire nation confronting the state and making it recognize that you're not the state, or you're not the nation. You don't represent or speak for the nation. We do. Obviously, we didn't get there. We're probably a long ways from ever getting there. But, it's a long-standing thing in American, I guess, in capitalist societies, of capitalism's incredible capacity to take the radical and to commodify it and to make mainstream it. And they've certainly managed to do that with a lot of what's gone on.
So I guess this, I want to pivot a little bit to the entrepreneurial intellectual, but I do want to ask you one question. Okay. And that's about the impending doom of the future. You said that you thought that a year ago, you thought that a lot of this would intensify under the Biden administration because historically it has. On the domestic terror front, there have been domestic terror attacks. They've not gotten a lot of press, actually. And some of them have been weird, like the subway shooting. Like it's not your typical white nationalist. There's also, however, been a development that is interesting, and that is that there is a coalition of people around the national conservative movement that have taken a lot of these lumpen and even petit bourgeois ideas and really given them an establishment intellectual sheen in the last year. Yeah. So you now have stuff like the Center for the people doing the National Conservatism Conference, the people around the Claremont Institute, the people around Tucker Carlson's buy into the American Conservative editorial panel and stuff like this, really taking what was largely a kind of revanchist reaction movement that we think came out of a mixture of the worst elements of the financial aristocracy, the petite bourgeoisie, and then a lumpen part of the mass base. But this has this reminds me, and I'm not equating it to fascism in the sense that I think it's the same, but the fascists had a similar movement where they had the class and street movement kind of first, and the intellectuals and then frankly Marxist defectors came later. Yeah. Are we seeing that now?
Yeah, I would start by saying I think the most consistent criticism of my book on the Lumpenproletariat has been you don't have a happy ending, nor do you point us in the direction of a potentially happy ending. And my answer to that is because at the current time, I don't see one. And in fact, what I said, to repeat myself at the beginning, Trump is not the cause of anything. Trump is the effect of a long-standing, long-developing social movement and logic of capitalism that will continue unabated until it is stopped. And to stop it requires organization. It requires political organization. We see inklings of it here and there, but nothing comparable to what I think is necessary to challenge this. I mean, we've still got 40% of the people who would go out at least and vote for Trump. Again, he could easily, I see, win an election. We may run the risk of losing the U.S. Congress to the Republican Party, to the real right wing of the Republican Party. So as we sit here and talk, I don't see the happy ending on the near horizon. What I see is more of the same, getting worse. And does it in many ways parallel the fascist movements of the 1930s? I think there's no question about it. And I don't feel hesitant to use the word fascism. I think that's what it is. And I don't think people take it serious enough. I certainly don't think the Democratic Party is taking it seriously enough.
Despite all their rhetoric that comes up.
About saving election. Democracy and all of that. No,
but they don't do anything, right?
No, exactly.
They have a commission that doesn't matter.
They talk. That's what they do.
Right. One thing I would say is you've criticized Marxists for not taking this seriously enough, partly because Marxists have pointed out, and you would agree rightly, that there's a lot of petit bourgeois elements in all this. Mm-hmm. But also if we're honest, a lot of young Marxists in particular have a knee-jerk reaction to want to own the libs just as bad as any conservative does, because rightfully we've frustrated them and don't like them very much. And when they hear the hot air the Democrats are blowing, they often counter-signal that. Now, as you're saying, the Democrats are just blowing hot air. They're not really doing anything about anything. And I would say not just about like dealing with the paramilitary elements of it. They'd also have to have social policies that would slow lumpenization. If anything, the end of this COVID response has indicated to me they don't. Despite all the talk, and I think actually their talk about it in 2020 and their lack of doing anything about it by 2022 is actually part of what's going to cost them so much, because they, in prior times, they always tamp down the talk too. Now they kind of they clearly were bad faith actors and we'll do that. We'll forgive $10,000 to $50,000 of student loan. We'll have a massive infrastructure program. We'll increase public investment. Oh no, inflation. Never mind. We're going to give up on all that immediately. Do we know why there's inflation? No. But still, we're going to try to run on a balanced budget amendment.
No, I think if the sort of things that I do point to in the book, and admittedly they don't command a lot of my attention in the book, but towards the end when I'm talking about people like Andre Gortz, of whom I'm a great admirer, he talks about post-industrial socialism as a politics of time. And what he means about that is that the cornerstone of the political agenda is to start talking, number one, about reducing the workday, which we haven't done since 1938. At least the Governor Newsom in California has actually finally started talking about the 32-hour work week. He's talking about universal basic income, the right to not work, or Paul Lafargue's old book, The Right to Be Lazy, that we really need to start thinking in terms of how you reallocate work in a social order where it's less and less necessary.
No, because technology, I want to make this martial logical point for my listeners. technology does not produce value, but it lowers socially necessary labor time, and
Mhm.
it's rapidly approaching very minimal socially necessary labor time.
Absolutely correct. Yep.
Which is also why you see so many other of the bourgeois things trying to get into rentier
Yeah.
relations.
In
and not
fact, let me say
production
that
relations.
one of the things that some of the people point out, well, Cleaver again was actually making the argument. We're long past the time of talking about socialism. It's time to just leap forward and start talking about communism with a small c, as Marx talked about it in the German ideology. That we've sort of passed by this whole sort of work-based, labor-based, industrial unionized stuff. That the politics of time is sort of leapfrogging that stage and saying, unlike the critique of the Gotha program, we don't need a transition anymore. Let's just do it.
I mean, it is. I mean, because one of the things that you would say, if socially necessary labor time, even in the developed world, is not, it'll never approach zero. But if it got pretty close, that is the technical definition for a lot of the stuff you need to have.
Absolutely.
Like,
Yeah, we're way beyond the surplus and affluence that Marx thought necessary to achieve this goal. I mean, we're so far beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, so far beyond it that we're consuming resources at a level that endangers our existence.
Exactly.
So I think I'm not going to have a huge more time, but I do think it's interesting. This book came after your Entrepreneurial Intellectuals book, because I think they're related. So one thing that you talk about in that book is neoliberalism's drive and the way the university has adapted to that in this particularly bizarre and inefficient administrative heavy way that has increasingly pushed intellectuals into like precarious petit bourgeois status. And that's led to a lot of weirdness. Would you like to discuss what the trends you see there and how they're tied into this?
Well, I actually started my career writing about, the development of the corporate university with universities in the capitalist state. And I've written a lot about that. And as I point out in the introduction of that book, I kind of, and not just me, there's a whole cottage industry now of critiques of the corporate university, critiques of the neoliberal university. And my argument was there, okay, we've done that. At what point do we start talking about how do we get beyond that? And, there's two ways, one of which is, we're not going to really transform the university as a whole, except to the extent that intellectuals are linked to and allied with much larger social movements. We can't do it by ourselves from within a university. But, based on my own experience, I directed a Center for Policy Analysis for, I think, 22 years, sort of an entrepreneurial entity that we managed to kind of spin off. And I said, what we did find was that by kind of redefining ourselves as kind of petit bourgeois entrepreneurs instead of as proletarianized intellectuals, we were able to achieve a great deal of autonomy and a great deal of autonomous space for ourselves, at least for a period of time, knowing that inevitably what was going to happen is that they were going to crush it, which they eventually did. I left my previous university, and literally out of 12 entrepreneurial centers that were there, there's only 2 left. And that's because they had big endowments. So they didn't have to be entrepreneurial. They were self-sustaining. And so what I was suggesting is what this points me to, and I haven't published this yet, but it points me to the idea of, I called it kind of a syndicalist university. And, now, of course, people have since asked me, well, you've talked about this as kind of a strategy at the interstice of the corporate university, at the margins underneath it, as kind of a resistance strategy that people could pursue in small groups. What would the whole thing look like? And I've sort of mapped that out, and I've done presentations in multiple places where I've actually laid out the framework of what I would call a democratically self-governed syndicalist university, in which intellectuals, if you will, keep the full value of what they produce. And, You know what? You'll be the number one consistent universal critique I get of that from faculty, from professors is, that all sounds beautiful. It sounds like a great idea, but there's one flaw to it. Actually, there's two. One is I don't trust my colleagues enough to want to be governed by them. And second is I don't want to have to waste my time in self-governance because it takes me away from writing my next book. So, I mean, I guess that's false consciousness at its worst, but that literally is the critique I get the most frequently.
Right, because the assumption is that a syndicalist university would work the same way as the university communities under the current regime, which is kind of ludicrous because you would, of course, value your own time.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's funny.
But what I was trying to get at was maybe there are some ways we could take neoliberalism and turn it against itself from within and make it work for ourselves. Because as you pointed out, neoliberal universities are all big on their metrics and accountability and efficiency and all this stuff. But time and time again, I find when you put their own metrics to them, they fail miserably. They're horribly inefficient.
The universities only become more inefficient and wasting on weird things, very strange things that make some immediate sense in the logic of attracting students under capital and assuming students are consumers, but not.
And in fact, you would be surprised. Actually, we've actually made some interesting breakthroughs at my own university where we had them. They actually broke down department by department the amount of revenue generated in state formula funding and student tuition versus the cost of operating that department, and actually created a profit reading for each department. Now, you would be surprised to find, guess who are the most profitable departments? It's the liberal arts and humanities. Guess who's all losing money? It's engineering and science.
Yeah,
and so
actually doesn't surprise me.
It doesn't surprise, but most people are surprised to hear that. And so it gave us leverage to say, yeah, let's use your own metrics and let's find out who's costing this university money. And then let's start reallocating some of those revenues to the places that generate that revenue on a more equitable basis. So, I've tried to argue too, there are times you can use these systems against themselves and with some transparency, come up with some findings that I think surprise a lot of people.
Yeah, my favorite finding, and I work in the secondary school market, but it's not really a market, but is just showing people why teachers' salaries in real terms have declined for the past 2 decades. The cost of educating a student on average nationally has doubled in the same time period. And 93% of all funds go to staff. Where is it going?
Mm-hmm. And it's the same in the university. All of the growth in terms of employment has been in staff. All these staff positions.
And it's not even at site staff. It's not at staff. I would point out, it's not even staff that you would interact with. It's not like we're hiring more janitors. Just it's been a slight uptick and site administrators and assistant and vice principals at schools. Yeah. Slight uptick. Most of it's hidden administration in the board office and legal.
And assessment. And assessment is another one, that we're going to assess. In fact, we just went through a whole process of assessment, but that wasn't good enough. So then we're now assessing our assessment. Literally, I'm not joking. Now, and that's a huge bureaucracy.
Right. But one of the things I think, one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this up, though, because it seems to me that until the last 10 years, that both towards the end of Keynesianism's high period and into neoliberalism, the push towards college is also, but it's also to hide the extent of semi-lumpenization by reducing who you count as unemployed.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think the colleges have become so top-heavy that our overlords are realizing that it's not sustainable anymore. But which also worries me because their way of fixing that, of course, is going to be reactionary. I always tell people, like, what's probably going to happen to fix the student debt problem? If Biden doesn't do it, it's probably not. It will be someone like Trump. And the deal will be, we're going to forgive all the student debt and we're going to end all federal aid to education, period.
Yeah.
Yep. And that'll be the Faustian bargain on the table.
I think that's a reasonable scenario to predict. Because here again, I think
Trump
everybody knows that universities are top heavy. I think the statistics are so clear and unequivocal, you can't argue with them. And yet, what happens is, you come in with these policies of we're going to reduce the cost of education. Well, the reduction always comes in the teaching staff. It never comes in the administrative staff because the people making the decisions on how to cut costs are the cost. They're not going to reduce themselves.
Right. It's a clear micro class interest, but yeah.
Okay.
I
had a situation at my previous university, quite literally, where over a 20-year period, our faculty numbers stayed identical. They never changed, but our enrollments doubled. Our research grants tripled. And so I'm sitting there. I was a union official at that institution with the faculty union. And I would always point out, I said, in any so-called business, our faculty productivity has doubled or tripled based on the numbers. And yet salaries don't go up. And again, it's this question of where does all this money go? It goes somewhere.
Yeah.
But not to education.
What I find fascinating, and this is what blew my mind, because before I became a teacher, and before I was an academic, even before that, in my 20s, I worked a variety of jobs. Like briefly a prison guard. I worked as a pizza cook and then a manager at the same place. Then I went into insurance, and then I went into the Lumpen academia as a new MFA who was 25 and could only get adjunct jobs, and then got hired abroad, and then went back into secondary teaching. But I say that because, one, my life actually looks like this whole crazy precarity thing that we're talking about, but also that it shows you a whole lot about the instability of this, because this whole time what I've been seeing is these trends that I saw in higher education. I then saw them in secondary, but I've also seen them in the private sector, and for the similar reasons. Like you have this empowered cadre of management that makes decisions about itself, and you get management bloat. And I saw that in insurance companies and for-profit corporate. Like initially I thought, well, I was young. I'm like, well, these corporations, at least they have a profit incentive, so they won't do this. And I was wrong.
I know there are a lot of, actually, just as a personal story, when I started as a professor, actually, my family physician in Massachusetts had graduated medical school the same year I graduated with my PhD. He became my physician. We sort of grew up together, and I sat and watched as his medical practice went from him sort of seeing a patient, spending an hour with him, to sort of burgeoning into this industrial factory system where he just processed us in and out, and he too would complain, and we would sort of share the similar complaint about how these whole systems had become industrialized, and the so-called experts never made any of the decisions. For me, it was the administration. For him, it was the insurance companies telling him how he could or could not treat patients. So it is a symptomatic development that you're seeing across the board, I think, in all of the so-called service industries around health and education in particular.
Yeah, I mean, all of them have cough disease. I mean, hospital admin bloat is also notorious.
Yeah.
And what I find interesting about that, as a person, I haven't talked about my background. I was kind of I was a person, because I kind of came out of this precarious part of the working class. My father was a mechanic. My mother was a waitress turned nurse. And she turned that my life experience very much sounds like what you're talking about. My family members have spread out across the class, but half of us have been downwardly trajectory out of, and you see the relation of, you know, particularly the gig workers, their ties to like drug addiction and thus being closer and closer to that element of society. It's been something I've seen in real time.
Yeah.
And so while part of me used that when I first read the Lumpen description in the Brumaire, I'm like, well, yeah, but that's like most of the working class. So Marx, you're not being fair. But as I've thought about, your book really helped me think about it. If I remove it and treat it as a social category, not a class, and then I see it as a spectrum, and that there's large parts of what we would consider the working poor who are part of that spectrum.
Yeah.
Then it makes a lot of sense, and it explains a lot of what I've experienced. And my class trajectory is not most people's, but one of the things I was telling someone is like, look, now, I was telling a friend of mine about this. Now I had to get 2 degrees and move up social classes to maintain the lifestyle that my working class family in the 70s had.
Yeah.
Like,
absolutely.
And so we're playing a red cream game that we're losing, but at the same time, all this efficiency we were promised under neoliberalism by getting rid of all this public sector stuff did not happen at all. And in fact, the opposite has happened in every case of
absolutely.
anything that has anything that intersects with law at all. You've just seen this explosion of management. And while I am a little, you may have noticed I say professional strata, I'm a little critical of the professional managerial class thesis for the fact that I also don't think it's truly a coherent class. I think there really is, though, something there in we have a strata of people who are not bourgeoisie, who are not necessarily parasitic on capital. And that's why I kind of separate them out, because some of them are and some of them aren't, are parasitic on the social production, but who are protected by rents or whatever, or by the state from the worst end of this precarization, even though it's happening now, right? Yeah. You're seeing that in nursing, you're seeing that in teaching, you're seeing that in the faculty at higher education, except for the star faculty. And that's pulling at the shreds of these, kind of staid things, and you see these people sort of radicalized, but they can cut in a lot of directions. I've been pointing people out. We shouldn't assume that anyone's going to stay loyal. And my example for that is like, okay, I want you to look at the Latin petit bourgeois, which have normally actually seen their interest in general with the working class, and because of that, they've kind of favored Democrats reluctantly, even though they more than often don't vote. And in the last 2 years, we got stat after stat after stat that we began to see under Trump. It was kind of localized to certain regions, but you look at actually parts of South Texas, you can see this, where you're seeing that weaken, that the ability of the Democrats to rely on that voting bloc is not going to be there. Partly because, like, on the things that they had that they could offer, such as immigration reform and economic stabilization, they failed at. So now they have nothing to offer those people, and then when you have nothing off there, gross immediate class interest, and micro class interest applies, and they're going to defect. They're going to either sit on their hands, are increasingly, like you started seeing, one of the things we started seeing with the national conservative movement, one thing we saw towards the end with even the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, is you started seeing increasingly Asian and Latin leaders of the movement. I think we're going to see more of that. I think it won't stay just a white issue if things continue the way they're going.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%.
Yeah. So is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
No, just thank you for having me. I've enjoyed our talk. And that's about it. We've covered a lot of ground.
I will say you flipped me on the Lumpen, because I was more or less convinced that it's not a coherent class. Therefore,
it's always good to hear that your argument was persuasive.
Right. And now, well, because I do think it's important that that spectrum and that late Marx and
Yeah.
Engels work really does indicate that it wasn't just moralization, and they knew that it was going to apply to people, that it wasn't just the like, former aristocratic weirdos and mountebanks that they were dealing with in France. Like they saw some of the writing on the wall, and the second and third internationals definitely saw it. And we've just been kind of like not dealing with it for 40 years as it's getting worse.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Yeah. And that's really the thrust of the book is you're going to have to deal with it one way or the other.
Right. Like you have to figure, I mean, and right now, given the size of the semi proletariat or the honest lumpen or whatever, you don't have a mass base unless you have some of them.
That's correct. That's absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. Because it's never growing segment of the population is going to continue to get bigger.
Yeah. And right now, the petit bourgeois in reaction kind of has at least the white and maybe increasingly other parts of it. So
that's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem that we face. Yeah. And, and I guess just to close it out, I mean, we always on the left end up in the same place. It's a problem of organization.
Yeah.
And there's no substitute for organization. It's action.
Yeah, when I talk to party builders, and I'm always like, look, I don't have a problem necessarily with a party. I'm not an anti-party person, but we got to
it doesn't have to be a political party. It could be a social movement, but it has to be something.
Well, but my response to them is the original, even though it came at a low point of worker organization, the original parties were coalitions of unions and political actors together. That's what they came out of, and if we don't have either side of that equation, like we're completely screwed.
Yes.
So,
but
that does mean we have to deal with things. One of the reasons why I'm not a total like electoral abstentionist is someone saying like, we have to deal with Taft-Hartley. We have to deal with stabilizing the conditions of working class people, figuring out how to reincorporate people who've been lumpenized into something.
I think we need to do all that, but let me tell you a story here real quickly on the history of American socialism. For years and years and years, the American Socialist Party, and before it, the Socialist Labor Party, spent an enormous amount of time every year at the annual conventions of the AFL at that time, trying to get them to endorse socialism and embrace socialism. And they kept losing and losing and losing, but they always thought they were getting closer until I believe it was the 1904 coalition convention. They were absolutely just crushed, just destroyed. And coming out of that, people like Eugene Debs and others said, you know what? Why are we wasting our time here with the AFL, which represents 5% of the working class? Let's just go directly to the working class and talk directly to the working class. We don't have to go through anyone else. And that's when their electoral fortunes started to skyrocket, and they started to win elections and to capture more and more votes right up through 1920. So there is a strategy that says you can build a party or you can build a movement by appealing directly to workers without going through intermediate organizations. It's easier to go through intermediate organizations, but it's not necessary.
Okay, thank you. I would agree with that. And I would also think why we need unions. I would say the industrial union model or whatever it's post our current, because without social unionizing, the unions are really stuck and they're kind of dying.
And that's another thing. I know we're kind of drifting off again here, but you use the word social union, which was a movement and a term that came out of the 1920s. There was a time when unions were much more than just economic organizations that bargained for wages, hours, and working conditions. They were entire microcosms of an alternative society. They operated labor schools and labor colleges. They operated theaters and local neighborhood theaters. They had their own banks, right? Labor banks and working men's cooperative banks. They offered insurance. They had the union hall. So where there was entertainment. So there were just, it was the whole effort to create a counter movement and a counter culture around the union, not just to bargain for wages and hours.
Yeah. Because when you're just bargaining for wages and hours, particularly when you're doing it non-oppositionally, which is common in most unions now, actually, you kind of feel like just the nice guys in HR.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So yeah, and on that somewhat dismal note, thank you for coming on.
Okay.
People need to check out your books. That's what's the exact title? The Dangerous Class: The Concept of Lumpenproletariat, Towards a Critical Theory of the State, which came out from SUNY in 2016, and the one that I keep just calling The Entrepreneurial Intellectual, but it's got a really long title, from Palgrave MacMillian. It's The Entrepreneurial Intellectual in
the Corporate University.
And the Corporate University, yeah. The Entrepreneurial Intellectual and the Corporate University from Palgrave and the Macmillan in 2018. So check out those books. They're really good. Libraries if you don't have the money, and because unfortunately they're academic books and can run kind of high, but they're in most libraries. So check those out, and thank you for coming on, and have a great evening.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to go watch the NFL draft.
All right, have fun.
Yeah.